November 18, 1993, MTV Unplugged Studios, New York City. The most watched episode in the show's history was about to unfold, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Madonna arrived at the studio in a black limousine, stepping out in her signature provocative style. She was at the peak of her career, the undisputed queen of pop culture, someone who had built her empire on controversy, sexuality, and the ability to make headlines with a single gesture. Everything she touched turned to gold. Every move she made became front-page news. The MTV Unplugged stage had been set for an intimate acoustic performance. 2 chairs, 2 microphones, soft lighting designed to create an atmosphere of vulnerability and raw musical honesty. This was supposed to be different from Madonna's usual spectacle. No backup dancers, no elaborate costumes, no choreographed sexuality, just the artist and the music. But Madonna had other plans. She had specifically requested Kurt Cobain as her guest for this episode. Ostensibly, it was about bridging the gap between pop and alternative rock, showing that great artists could collaborate across genres. The MTV executives loved the idea. The pairing would generate massive ratings, combining Madonna's mainstream appeal with the cult following of Nirvana's enigmatic frontman. Kurt had been reluctant. He'd agreed only because his management convinced him it would be good exposure for Nirvana's upcoming album. He didn't particularly want to share a stage with Madonna, didn't understand what they had in common musically, didn't see the point of the collaboration. But he'd show up, play a few songs, and leave quietly. That was Kurt's approach to most things. Show up, do the work, avoid the drama. Madonna saw it differently. She'd been watching the grunge movement from a distance, intrigued by its authenticity, its rejection of everything her career represented. Kurt Cobain, in particular, fascinated her. He was everything she wasn't: understated, genuinely tortured, seemingly immune to fame's corrupting influence. He represented something pure that she'd lost along the way, if she'd ever had it at all. During the rehearsal that afternoon, Madonna tested the waters. She sat closer to Kurt than necessary, touched his arm while talking, made eye contact that lasted a beat too long. Kurt responded politely but distantly. He wasn't rude, but he wasn't engaging with her attempts at intimacy either. "You're very mysterious," Madonna said during a break between sound checks. Kurt shrugged. "Not really, just here to play music." "Everyone's here to play music, but you're different. You don't seem to want anything from anyone." "I don't," Kurt said simply. Madonna found his disinterest intoxicating. She was used to men falling over themselves to impress her, to get closer to her, to be associated with her fame. Kurt seemed genuinely uninterested in any of that. It was a challenge she couldn't resist. The show was set to broadcast live at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. By 9:30, the studio was packed with MTV executives, camera crews, and a small audience of industry insiders and contest winners. The energy was electric. Everyone knew they were about to witness something special, though no one knew exactly what. Madonna had changed into a simple black dress for the taping, playing against type by dressing down rather than up. But even her attempts at simplicity carried an edge of calculated sensuality. She was never not performing, never not aware of how she appeared to others. Kurt sat in his chair wearing a green cardigan sweater over a t-shirt and torn jeans. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, but he was professional. He tested his guitar one last time, adjusted his microphone, and waited for the cameras to roll. The show began normally. Madonna performed Like a Prayer acoustically, stripping away the gospel choir and elaborate production to reveal the song's emotional core. Her voice, without all the studio effects, was surprisingly vulnerable. The audience was captivated. Kurt followed with Come As You Are, the Nirvana hit that had defined a generation's relationship with authenticity and self-acceptance. His voice was raw, unpolished in the best way, carrying pain and hope in equal measure. The contrast between his performance and Madonna's was stark but complementary. Then came the moment that changed everything. Madonna, finishing her second song, stood up from her chair as the applause died down. Instead of sitting back down, she walked over to where Kurt was sitting. The cameras followed her, unsure what was happening but instinctively knowing it was important. "Kurt," she said into her microphone, her voice carrying across the studio, and into 50 million homes. I want to thank you for being here tonight. You've shown me something real. Kurt looked up at her, guitar still in his hands, unsure where this was going. In fact, Madonna continued, stepping closer, you've inspired me to be real too. The studio held its breath. The camera operators kept rolling, though some looked to their directors for guidance. This wasn't in the script. Madonna leaned down toward Kurt, clearly intending to kiss him. It wasn't subtle. 50 million viewers could see exactly what was happening. Her lips moved toward his, her eyes closed, her body language unmistakable. Kurt saw it coming and did something no one expected. He didn't jump back. He didn't push her away. He didn't make a scene. Instead, he gently placed his hand on her shoulder, stopping her advance, and looked directly into her eyes with an expression of such kindness and clarity that it was more powerful than any rejection could have been. Madonna, he said quietly, but his microphone picked it up, carrying his words to those 50 million viewers. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this isn't real. This is performance. And right now, we're supposed to be sharing something true. The silence in the studio was deafening. Camera operators forgot to move their cameras. Sound engineers stared at their boards. The audience didn't dare breathe. Madonna straightened up slowly, her face cycling through embarrassment, anger, and finally something that looked like respect. She'd been called out, gently but firmly, in front of the largest audience of her career. You're right, she said finally, her voice smaller than anyone had ever heard it. I'm sorry. Sometimes I forget where performance ends and life begins. She walked back to her chair, sat down, and for the first time in years looked genuinely vulnerable rather than strategically vulnerable. Kurt picked up his guitar and began playing About a Girl, one of Nirvana's most accessible songs, but he dedicated it to Madonna, not as a romantic gesture, but as an offering of genuine artistic connection. This is for Madonna, he said into his microphone, for having the courage to admit when something isn't working. His performance of the song was gentle, almost tender. He wasn't showing off or making a statement. He was simply offering her the gift of real music, real emotion, real connection without any ulterior motive. When he finished, the applause was different. Not the wild screaming that usually accompanied MTV performances, but something deeper, respectful, moved. Madonna wiped tears from her eyes, and for once, they seemed genuine. Thank you, she said to Kurt. That was beautiful. The rest of the show proceeded without incident. They performed a few more songs separately, and the episode ended with an awkward but sincere handshake between two artists who had found an unexpected moment of truth together. The show aired as planned, uncensored. MTV executives debated whether to edit out the attempted kiss, but ultimately decided it was too powerful, too real to cut. The response was immediate and massive. Every entertainment news show led with the story. Every newspaper ran headlines about Madonna being rejected on live television, but the coverage wasn't entirely negative. Many commentators praised Kurt's handling of the situation, noting how he'd managed to deflect Madonna's advance without humiliating her, how he'd turned a potentially explosive moment into something meaningful. Madonna herself was surprisingly gracious about the incident in the press. She didn't try to spin it or minimize what had happened. Kurt Cobain taught me something that night, she told Rolling Stone a week later. He showed me the difference between being provocative and being authentic. I spent so much of my career pushing boundaries that I forgot some boundaries exist for good reasons. Some moments are too sacred to turn into spectacle. Kurt, predictably, said very little about the incident publicly. When asked about it in interviews, he would simply say, Madonna's a talented artist. We had a good show together. But people close to him said he was proud of how he'd handled it. He'd managed to protect both his own integrity and Madonna's dignity, even as she'd put both at risk. The incident marked a subtle turning point in Madonna's career. Not an ending, but a moment of reflection. She continued making music, continued pushing boundaries, but there was a new thoughtfulness to her work. She seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, that authentic provocation required more than just breaking taboos. For Kurt, the incident reinforced something he'd always known, but rarely articulated. That real power came from being yourself, completely and unapologetically, without needing to prove anything to anyone. Years later, after Kurt's death, Madonna would often reference that MTV Unplugged performance in interviews. She'd talk about it as a moment that changed her understanding of what it meant to be an artist, about the difference between seeking attention and deserving it. Kurt was the only person who ever said no to me on television, she said in a 2004 interview with Oprah Winfrey. And he did it with such grace that it didn't feel like rejection. It felt like education. He taught me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose not to do something. The MTV Unplugged episode became one of the most watched in the show's history, but not because of the music. People watched it to see the moment when two different approaches to fame and artistry collided and authenticity won. It became a touchstone for discussions about celebrity, manipulation, and genuine human connection. Kurt hadn't just rejected a kiss, he'd rejected the entire machinery of manufactured controversy that drove so much of entertainment culture. In doing so, he'd shown that real artists didn't need to create drama to be compelling. They just needed to be truthful. The moment lasted maybe 30 seconds on screen, but its impact lasted decades, reminding everyone who saw it that sometimes the most powerful response to performance is simply to refuse to perform. What happened backstage after the cameras stopped rolling told the rest of the story. Madonna sat in her dressing room staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her makeup was smudged from the tears she'd shed during Kurt's performance, and for once, she didn't immediately reach for her compact to fix it. She just stared at herself, trying to recognize the person looking back. Her publicist knocked on the door. "Madonna, the press wants statements. How do you want to handle this?" "Tell them I'll talk tomorrow," she said without turning around. "I need time to think." It was the first time in years she'd turned down an immediate opportunity to control the narrative. Down the hall, Kurt was packing up his guitar in a much smaller, simpler dressing room. No entourage, no publicist waiting outside. Just him and the battered Fender that had been with him since before anyone knew his name. Dave Grohl, who'd been watching from the side of the stage, knocked and entered. "That was something else, man," Dave said. "The way you handled that, I've never seen anything like it." Kurt shrugged, the same gesture he'd made hours earlier during rehearsal. "She's not a bad person. She's just lost, maybe. Fame does things to people." "You don't seem lost." "I try not to be," Kurt said, closing his guitar case. "But it's not easy. The temptation to become what people want you to be instead of who you are, it's always there." Dave watched his friend with new understanding. He'd always known Kurt was different from other rock stars, but tonight had shown him exactly how different. "You think she learned anything from it?" Kurt considered this. "I hope so. She's talented enough to be real if she wants to be. She just has to remember how." Meanwhile, in the MTV control room, executives were having heated discussions about how to handle what they just broadcast. "We could edit it," suggested one programmer. "Make it look like a friendly handshake. Play up the musical collaboration angle." The show's producer, who'd been in television for 20 years, shook his head. "No, that moment was the most honest thing we've ever put on air. We don't edit honesty. But the controversy will blow over. But what Kurt did tonight, that's what people will remember. Not the controversy, but the grace." The producer was right. In the days following the broadcast, while tabloids ran sensational headlines about Madonna's rejection, the serious music press focused on something different. They wrote about authenticity in an age of manufactured celebrity, about the courage it takes to be vulnerable on live television, about what happens when real artistry encounters performance art. Rolling Stone dedicated a cover story to the incident, titled "The Moment Pop Met Grunge." But the article wasn't about the attempted kiss. It was about two different philosophies of fame colliding and finding unexpected common ground. Kurt Cobain didn't just reject Madonna, the article concluded. He offered her something more valuable than any kiss: the possibility of being real. The incident changed how people thought about both artists. Madonna's subsequent work showed a new introspection, a willingness to be vulnerable without calculating the effect. Her 1994 album, Bedtime Stories, was praised for its emotional honesty, a quality many critics said had been missing from her earlier work. Kurt, meanwhile, seemed to grow more confident in his own skin. The gentle authority he'd shown that night on MTV began appearing in his performances, his interviews, his interactions with fans. He'd proven to himself that he could be strong without being aggressive, that he could protect his boundaries without destroying others. The two artists never collaborated again, but they developed an unexpected mutual respect. When Kurt died in April 1994, Madonna was one of the first celebrities to issue a statement, and it wasn't a typical press release filled with generic platitudes. Kurt taught me that being an artist means being honest, even when it's uncomfortable, she said, especially when it's uncomfortable. He showed me that real strength comes from knowing who you are and having the courage to be that person, regardless of what anyone else expects. I will carry that lesson with me forever. At Kurt's memorial service, which was attended by thousands of fans and fellow musicians, someone read Madonna's full statement aloud. It was longer than most people expected, and more personal. I knew Kurt for less than a day, the statement read, but in that day, he changed how I understand what it means to be an artist. He didn't just make great music, he lived great music. He was the same person on stage and off, in public and in private, under pressure and in peace. That's the rarest thing in this business. Maybe the rarest thing in life. I spent years trying to be what I thought people wanted from Madonna. Kurt showed me it was more important to be what I needed from myself. The MTV Unplugged episode continued to be replayed, becoming one of the network's most requested programs. But what people watched for changed over time. Initially, viewers tuned in to see the moment of rejection, the spectacle of Madonna being turned down on live television. But as years passed, they came for something deeper. They came to see what authentic human connection looked like in an artificial medium. They came to witness the exact moment when performance stopped and truth began. They came to understand that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do as an artist isn't to create drama, but to refuse to participate in it. Music historians would later mark that November night as a turning point in the 1990s culture, the moment when the manufactured controversy of the late 80s began giving way to the more introspective, authentic approach that would define alternative rock and eventually influence all of popular music. But for the two artists at the center of it, the lesson was simpler and more personal. Madonna learned that authenticity couldn't be performed, only lived. Kurt learned that his quiet strength could change not just his own life, but the lives of others, even those who seemed to have everything. The moment lasted 30 seconds, but its truth was timeless.